Um, so today, yeah, like I said, we're running this 4-week course on really listening and, how to use design research to understand problems. But really today we're going to focus on the art of conversations. And I want to sort of share a bit of a story around one time where we were doing research into unemployment. And obviously, as you know, unemployment is like a very sensitive topic for lots of people in terms of how it affects your self-esteem and how you're viewed, I guess, by society. But really, we were looking at unemployment to actually help the government create a new policy, right, based on people's experience. And obviously, the government's perspective is like, how can we help get people into jobs? And people's perspectives, vary depending on their experience, really. And I would say it was really powerful and sort of almost enlightening, actually going to someone's home and talking to them about, their situation and their experience of unemployment. And really sort of taking the time to listen to people's different perspectives of unemployment and the effect of that, and how government can or shouldn't help, and what role government can play. And I would say this is really like the crux of conversations in design research. Like, you really do want to take the step back to listen to people's experience, which is going to be the focus of our session today. So hopefully I can, we can give you some skills to help you do that. Last week, though, in case you weren't here, we spoke about a few things. We spoke about the goal of design research. How do we narrow into our research objectives in order to sort of, get questions that really make sense for people and aren't really influenced by our view of the world or our own experience of unemployment. And then we also spoke about like, what are the different research methods we can use, and then how can we combine them to sort of, get breadth in terms of like talking to lots of people, but also get really deep in terms of understanding people's experience. Today, though, what we're going to focus on is we're going to talk about why conversations really matter and how to reduce your influence. I think the mark of a good design researcher is not, whether they can ask questions or not. I think it's actually being able to take a step back and sort of, take yourself out of the situation and really understand your experience of the problem or your views on the problem, and sort of, taking a step back from that and really asking questions around, what are the questions that we really need to ask here. We're also going to talk about how to facilitate an interview, how you can, make sure that you're really listening. And then we're going to give you tips that help you, understand if you're doing a good or not so good of a job, and then also what to do after your research. Any questions so far about anything we're going to cover?
No.
Cool. Awesome. This is pretty informal group, so feel free to ask questions as we go. All right, so the first reflection exercise, and I think we're going to split into a few different groups today, so you get to meet different people as well, is what are the ingredients of a good or bad conversation? Usually we work in Miro, so I'll post a link to that now into the chat. But yeah, really we want to spend just a few minutes sort of talking as a group about the ingredients of a good and bad conversations. Any questions about that activity?
No.
Cool, awesome. I've just opened all the rooms and I'll paste the Miro link into the chat so you can access that as well. We'll just wait for a few more people. I think people are coming back from their groups. All right, cool. So any sort of patterns that emerged as you were discussing, what makes a good or bad conversation? Kyle, I haven't heard from
Hey, so yeah, we talked a lot about the good and bad side of validation. The good side of validation being just recognizing that you're hearing a person, you understand a person. The bad side being seeking approval. Like I'm here to validate my biases. I'm here to drag you along and lead the conversation.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. We're going to talk today, actually, interestingly, about like how do you sort of like help people open up, but not necessarily without leading them down a specific path, which I think is a really difficult skill that I'm still, actually trying to work on. Anyone else? Vicky, do you want to share?
So I'm sorry, I am new to this. So when I went into the Miro board, I see that there's a lot of board setup. And so
Yeah.
I thought that that was an activity for us to do in the board. But I understand now that we were supposed to be thinking about this question, the ingredients of a good or bad conversation.
That's okay.
And so just sort of ad hoc, speaking off the top of my head,
Yeah.
I just kind of feel that good or bad conversation, a good conversation is where, both parties are sort of free flowing. They feel like they are comfortable enough to
Yeah.
speak. And, there's not an interruption. Both sides can sort of complete their statement and question. And so I guess those are kind of the basics, I feel, of a good conversation.
Yeah, cool. Awesome.
But maybe not, maybe a bit of a broad term. Maybe when it comes to user research, we might have a different definition of good and bad, right?
Yeah.
Depending on the content, but just broadly speaking.
No, absolutely. I think that the first part of your response actually reminded me very much of like what Nicholas was saying in terms of like having that flow. Like you almost feel that it's a bit of like a dance. Like you really feel like, the vibe. Yeah. So thanks. Yeah. And absolutely. It is a bit different, I guess, when you're sort of like, you're not just like talking to someone as friends, but like you're asking them questions about, their experience. Good to see you, Nicholas. All right. So, we're going to start by talking about reflexivity, which I think is really important. It's like almost like the personal work that you have to do in order to sort of position yourself in the right frame of mind to actually do the research and design and facilitate the conversation. So reflexivity really is about like examining our own beliefs, judgments, and practices, right? It actually means taking the time, and it does really require time, both individually and as a team, to sort of step back and say, what are my thoughts and beliefs about this problem, right? Or the people that experience this problem, right? Like a common like we all have, biases, and, we all tend to group people and have stereotypes and things like that. So it's really sort of taking a step back and saying, what's happening for me here? What could I be bringing into the interview that might not be very helpful? And often, I guess the challenge is like we think of research as just research, right? We think of like research as like this objective thing. We've got, almost like a list of questions and we want to ask. But the challenge really is like, we've got us, right, as design researchers or, people interested in understanding a problem. And we really get to shape that research, right? And that research, if we're all the common like group that gets picked on nowadays is like white male men, but equally for all like low income from low income families, and we're exploring like say domestic violence in like high income families, right? It's like we will have our own thoughts. So it's like almost like when you come regardless of where you're coming from and regardless of what the problem is, you get to shape the research, which is a privilege, but at the same time, there's a risk there of you shaping the research in a specific way that's not as helpful. And I guess sort of 3 reasons why reflexivity matters and actually taking that time. It's like the first thing, and hopefully we all know this, is like we're not impartial, right? We're not, you know, even though we'd like to say, you know, I see the world just as it is. It's very difficult to do that, and it's, you know, I would say almost impossible. And our experience really colors the world that we see. You know, if I, you know, like for example, I was born in Egypt, right? And that colors like my view on things like poverty or, you know, government or things like that, right? Whereas, you know, someone else who's grown up in the US or Canada or Asia or whatever will have a very different view. And really the point is to reduce our influence so that, you know, we get the research almost to speak for itself and help people speak for themselves rather than, you know, pigeonholing them or hearing the stories that we already have heard, you know, since we were young. So here's the next activity. So the next activity is going to be basically as a team, imagine that you're trying to understand the experience of people caring for their elderly parents, right? And then reflect on like, what are we as a team, but what am I also bringing into that conversation, right? In terms of like beliefs or judgments or practices, right? Like, you know, do I have that experience or what's my view on that experience? Any questions before we go again into groups? All right. Yeah.
One quick question. So will we need to write anything down in Miro, or is this just sort of just a conversation with each other?
So usually we do a mix. You'll see with all activities, usually we like people to write down to sort of, you know, because it also helps like people sort of build on what you're writing down, especially like across groups. So, but feel free to have the conversation first and then, you know, or one person writes someone else's thoughts or things like that. So yeah, feel free to play it together as a team. There's no like hard and fast rules, as long as I guess you have the conversation and share.
Okay, great. Thanks.
All right. All right, so I've just recreated the teams again, the groups again. That way, you know, you get to meet other people. And yeah, they should be open now. So we'll have 5 minutes for that as well. Thanks a lot for taking the time. I thought my team personally like went really deep, which I think was almost like enlightening, right? Like you know, we talk about like these abstract concepts of like reflexivity and like understanding where you're coming from and like your experience and stuff like that. And then you actually do an activity and you're like, you know, almost blown away by like, yeah, people just sharing their experience. Any reflections on that? Should I pick on a few people? Nicholas, any thoughts on that? Did you just hide? Dawn, what about you? Any thoughts?
Well, I didn't write this one down, but I thought someone made an interesting observation in our group where they said that, one second here, the shift in managing shift of ego states is a challenge on both ends. And I can see that, I can relate to that in the sense that as I get older and I watch my parents get older, I realize that our roles in each other's lives are sort of changing, where I'm becoming more of the caregiver and they're the ones that need the help, as opposed to when you're a child and they're the caregiver and you're the one who needs all the guidance. It's hard, I think, for both people to make that that transition. I do see that. I see where my father sometimes is angry because he thinks that I think that he can't do certain things that he thinks he can still do, for example.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really, I don't know who, like I said, I don't know who wrote that, but I thought that was really, really good. I don't know. It was touching. It was touching.
Yeah.
So something.
Oh, sorry. You go, Pia.
Sorry.
No.
Something along those lines came up in our group as well, where the loss of independence kind of like takes a toll on the elderly. So I mean, like assuming that they can't do something that they feel competent to do is like it's a weird transition for people, and it's important to be like mindful of that. And I think the kids in that or the children in that situation might not be as empathetic as they probably like should be. Not like singling you out, Don, like that wasn't like an attack or anything. Just like in in things I've seen, because it's like the kids have their own lives and they're living their own lives, and they kind of have to like stop living their lives kind of the way they want to kind of take care of their parents more as they age.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess like all of this stuff that you're bringing up in terms of like what that's like, right? I guess there's two thoughts, right? There's one like where you strip like the researcher of all their humanness, right? And you sort of just like, you know, put all those experiences back. And I think that's one view. But personally, I think it's actually more about understanding what has that experience been like for me. And I think it's a lot more difficult when you've had that experience, you know, because you can't help but sort of really understand where the person's coming from. But it's bringing that experience and saying, you know, we need to be mindful when we're asking, you know, this question or that question, because it's a really sensitive topic, right? Like it's not just like it's not just like a conversation where you're just asking questions and the person's answering and then you go to the next question, right? Like you're dealing with a human life here and you're dealing with someone's like raw story, you know, the experience of them either going through it right now or them reliving it, you know, from a year or two ago. And you really have to be sort of like cautious with that. You have to be like, you know, it's something precious that you're dealing with. It's not, you know, it's not a toy that you're playing with. Cool. All right, so I want to talk about the gray man, which is basically you have, I guess, one thing that's been sort of been powerful to me. And when I actually, it was weird, right? When I searched for gray man on Google, what I actually ended up with was like not at all anything to do with design research. It's actually like how to blend in so you can like minimize threats to yourself, right? Like in the case of like say an explosion or something like that. I was like, that's really interesting. That like that's the first thing that came up. But anyway, when I'm talking about the gray man, it's like, you know, if you're doing a research project like say on the homeless, right? You don't go dressed in a suit, right? You don't go sort of like standing over someone who's experiencing homelessness while they're sitting down and, you know, you're moving your arms around. What you do is like you dress like as casually and as, you know, as sort of down to earth as possible and go and sit next to them and talk to them, right? You will really want to blend in. You don't want to, you know, even just to help that person feel comfortable. Like that's the biggest thing with it. But also you don't want to be, you know, seen as like, you know, just standing over them and sort of, you know, doing lots of like quick movements and things like that. So you have to, yeah, we really need to be mindful. I don't like saying you have to, but we really need to be mindful of like the environment that we're doing research in. You know, I think like Bishan, you know, your team might, for example, hopefully get someone like from Afghanistan, right? And you need to be mindful of like, how do you dress on Zoom when you're talking to an Afghan farmer, right? Dawn, similar thing when you're talking to someone experiencing homelessness. Any questions before I go to this slide and talking about actually facilitating a conversation? Any comments? Kyle?
Well, I have a quick question. When you're talking about sort of relating to the person that you're talking to, and, you know, trying to sort of fit in, it's quite different though now with a lot of these things being conducted on Zoom or online. And so would you comment on that? Like I'm assuming when you're talking about interviewing, that would be on-site, in-person interview. But if you were talking about facilitating something that
like
is
a virtual conversation.
Right.
Yeah. What do you think, Vicky? Or any thoughts from the group? I mean, I've got my own thoughts, but yeah, I'd love to hear like people's thoughts on that.
I just, you know, it's interesting. I've never really thought about like what I was wearing or anything like that, especially not now, when we're, you know, when we're conducting interviews online. And so, but it's something that I never actually thought about. And so I think it is kind of important, you know, to sort of make people feel comfortable and feel, you know, more casual. So maybe I would venture to say to be a little more casual than, you know, than in an in-person sort of, you know, depending on your audience.
Yeah, I would say, and I guess, you know, it's different like when you're talking to say like someone, like say a group of CEOs, right, versus like someone experiencing homelessness. Obviously, or
right,
you know, that changes, but I think the same principles apply, right? Like, you know, I can't have my Ferrari in the background when I'm talking to a person experiencing homelessness, you know, when over Zoom, right? Like, you know, that's why like backgrounds are really helpful. You can just put a background of anything, and you know. But I think the same. It's a really good question, because a lot of things have changed in terms of like, you know, like I was doing research right before coronavirus hit, and right like as coronavirus was hitting, and the biggest thing was like, instead of like inviting people to our offices to talk, all of a sudden I could see their house. You know what I mean? Like I was talking to them where they were accessing government services, say. And that was like a sort of a pretty cool thing, right? Because all of a sudden you're not in like an artificial environment where, you know, they're a bit on edge and things like that. They're actually like sitting at their dining table or on their couch and, you know, talking to about their experience of dealing with government. But yeah, I think that's a really good question. Kyle, I sense that you had some thoughts.
Yeah, admittedly we parking lot this, but I wanted to get your thoughts on diary research, because we're walking through a lot of a big minefield here, where we're interjecting ourselves into the research, and we have to back away from that. And I've been trying to push my researchers on my team to transition to diary studies, just so that we can back away and not be ever present, and we know that we're doing a lot of leading research right now. And it's just kind of what you said before, is we were in an extreme privileged position to, you know, the hypotheses that are coming from way above my pay grade are like, you have to prove this, so make sure you're answering these 5 questions. And it's like, we're not getting anything valuable anymore. Let's just do something radical. Let's try diary studies instead. So
I think,
might be
yeah.
a question to parking lot for later, but
Sure, awesome. Let's do parking lot. That's a good concept.
okay.
So I want to talk about facilitating conversation, and I guess sometimes you'll notice like I use like specific words. It's just like a little quirk about me, and it's like often people call them interviews. And interviews to me just remind me of like jobs, right? Like applying for jobs. So I use conversations. You know, other people use listening sessions and things like that. But I think it is a conversation because you're not just listening, like, you know, you're not just listening, like taking a step back and just listening to the person's experience. You do need to be a bit curious in terms of like, you know, tell me more a bit about that, or, you know, tell me more about like what it was like transitioning, you know, from your parents' house to your house, right, when you were taking care of them. I would say there's probably like a cool sort of conceptual framework for how people often facilitate conversations. And really the first 2 parts there on the left are like introductions, right, and building rapport. An introduction really is about like, you know, this is the thing that we want to talk to you about. You know, we want to talk to you about your experience of caring for your parents. And, you know, we're working for this company, or we're doing, you know, we're focusing on that project. And this is how, you know, the information you give us will be used. And, you know, can we take your consent, say, to record you or take notes, or, you know, take an audio or video recording or whatever, right? That's like the introduction, really, just the basic, like, this is why we're here. Then you really get into like, okay, it's time to sort of like help the person actually feel comfortable, right? You're not like, you know, getting them to fill out a survey. I like surveys for some reasons, but I really despise them for others. But you really sort of want to create that human connection. Like, you know, how's your day been? Like, how long have you been in this job? What have you been doing? What have you enjoyed? What haven't you enjoyed? And it's not specifically tied to your research objective, right? But it might be. But it's really sort of like opening questions. And then we start talking about stories, right? It's like, tell me the last time, you know, you were dealing with your parents, or the last time your parent got upset from you from something, and what was that about? And that sort of, a lot of researchers really stop at that part, really. They're just like listening to the surface experience and not really drilling deep into like understanding people's emotions and needs at those times. And that's really sort of like empathizing and going deeper. That's really sort of where you want to spend almost most of the time, sort of letting them share their stories, but going deep in their stories and saying, you know, what did you need at that time? Or what did you feel like could have helped? Or, you know, tell me more about this or that. And it's really about being genuinely curious, right? It's like, you're almost like, well, as human beings, we almost always have like this curiosity about us that we genuinely just want to understand, like what they were thinking or feeling, or what it was like. And you might go through like the stories, empathizing and going deeper a few times, right? Depending on like what you're exploring. So it's almost like a little loop in terms of like, you know, you talk about a story and you really empathize and you understand what they were feeling, and you explore that story. And then you say, okay, tell me about another time that you did this or you experienced that. And you sort of go through those loops, and that's almost the part that's most difficult for people. And we'll talk about why and how to do it well. But it's also the most important part, right? It's like typically like the most difficult is the most important, right? And then once you've sort of done that loop a few times, depending again on your research study, then you actually wrap up and you say, you know, thanks so much for your time. This is, you know, what's going to happen in terms of next steps. Like, you know, for example, you might send them their transcript or their recording to make sure, you know, they didn't share any sensitive information or things that they want to retract or things like that. And really this whole thing it's about understanding, going deep and exploring their experience, right? Like, you really want to understand the problem so that you can solve it. Because if you just understand the problem without solving it, then that, you know, that doesn't really help anyone. And if you don't really understand the problem and then you try to solve it, well, that doesn't really help anyone either, right? So it's really, you really need to make sure you've got a solid understanding. And that's why we say, you know, one interview is not enough, but at the same time, you don't need 100 interviews, right? Like, you know, go for 5 to 10 interviews. Yeah. Any questions or comments about that?
Yeah, I think languaging, paying attention to language or languaging is very important too. It may not seem that much to many or some people, but I think asking questions like, can you tell me, as opposed to saying, tell me.
Yeah.
Again, they may not be important to some people, but it may be to other people. How you present yourself and the impression or image that you leave behind after you've done the questioning. Not only is it respectful, but the way you ask questions can also be empowering to people
Mm-hmm.
and make them welcoming to you coming back again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an amazing point. Thanks for pointing that out, Terence. Any other points or thoughts or questions?
It sounds like what you were just talking about, the empathize and go deeper is the tightrope that we were talking about earlier between validating the conversation in an effective way versus leading a conversation and looking for bias approval.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's sort of why you know, we're going to talk about like open questions and things, but that's why you don't want to use closed questions, because you're not really trying to sort of test like your assumptions. You're actually more trying to understand. And by going deeper and asking open questions, then you give them, you know, almost a space to explore that question in a way that they think works, as opposed to, you know, narrowing the path for them and saying, you know, tell me about this specific thing, or, you know, yeah, how costly was it, you know, to take care of your parents? Like, maybe I'm really rich and it didn't cost me that much money, right? So there's this diagram, you can look it up later, but in terms of like levels of listening, and, you know, I think we've spoken about that in like good and bad conversations, but really what we want to focus on is like, you know, the completely high end of the spectrum, which is like empathetic listening. And it's like, you're listening to genuinely understand, you're genuinely curious about this person's experience and what they needed at that time. And it's non-judgmental, right? It's like almost what you're hearing is what you're writing. It's not, you're trying to avoid that interpretation layer, which tells you like this was important or this wasn't. You're actually trying to get that sense from people, how important that issue for them was. So some tips in terms of like how to really listen. Encourage stories, right? Because stories sort of open up the field for people to explore different parts of their experience. Don't be afraid of silence. I think that's probably one thing that sort of junior researchers do. It's like every time there's like a silence, they sort of want to fill it, right? Because you want to feel that flow going, as opposed to just like feel that awkwardness. And it is difficult, but usually after that silence, you get like a really good quote, right? You get a really good insight in terms of how that was feeling, or an insight about the problem they were facing. Ask open-ended questions, and like Terence was saying, you know, you have to be sort of mindful of how you phrase your questions, and talk about feelings and needs, right, rather than just like stories and experiences at a surface level. Again, go deep rather than just like covering lots of stories and you don't really understand them. So go deep on 1 or 2 or 3 experiences. And you always have another interview, right, where you can focus on other experiences. You don't have to get, you know, the person's life story from them, you know, spend 6 hours with them. You can just spend an hour with them, understand a few things really well, and then understand a few more things really well from the next interview. And ask why. And I guess when you ask why, you have to be mindful in terms of like not like getting people to be defensive about like their reasoning behind something, but genuinely curious. And last tip there is to observe nonverbal cues. Like you can tell, hopefully, you can tell when someone's getting a bit uncomfortable, or if they're, you know, starting to really open up and, you know, they're in the flow. Any other tips that anyone else wants to add in terms of like how to really listen?
I actually like the initial question that you had mentioned earlier, was tell me about the journey or your walk from your house to your parents' house. I think what I liked about the question, that specific question, type of question, was that it is asking about a critical part that they repeated, and something that they can delve into the memory and get out quickly.
Mhm.
And then, depending on the mood and the sentiment, it can pull up a lot more of things, and it just makes it so much more easier because you've asked a question about something which is done very frequently and is probably fresh and strong in their memory versus a specific incident about a fall or something may not be, but this is something which is, it's a high probability of being a common denominator and high probability of being a high frequency with many.
Yeah, it's almost like not too specific, so broad enough that a lot of people can answer it, rather than just like, no, my parents didn't fall. Like, well, why would you think that they fell?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so this one's going to be in pairs, and I want a volunteer to pair up with me. But we're going to spend 15 minutes discussing a topic that's important to you. The person interviewee. I couldn't find another word for that, so we'll use it. But the interviewee gets to choose a topic that's important to them. And the facilitator, your job is to really sort of like go through that, right? Like build rapport, introduce. You don't really need to introduce because people know what we're doing. Build rapport, go deep on their experience, understand their feelings and their needs, and then sort of wrap up at the end. So we'll spend sort of 15 minutes, and each person will get to act as a facilitator and then act as the interviewee. Any questions before we hit that?
Well, I wanted to mention one last comment.
Yeah.
As far as listening, I think it's very important to listen for when you want to ask questions versus when the person actually just want to talk to you. That's a very treasured moment, to take advantage of that, not in a negative way, but be willing to listen when they just want to tell you a story or about something, or like I said, just simply wanting to talk to you. Some people may rush that and say, well, to themselves, I have questions to ask, but I think that a lot can come out of those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, Terrence, like you say, it is about taking the time, right? You don't need to like answer the 15 questions that you have on your paper during the hour. It's really about sort of like, if we get 2 or 3 questions, great. Like we understand something that we didn't understand before. Pia, are you happy to join me as, in my little pair?
Yeah, sure.
That's what Zoom recommends, so I have to listen. All right, cool. We'll open it up, and yeah, you've got, let's call it 25 minutes. So whatever your time is plus 25. We're in so many places in the world, I can't tell you like 1:55. So yeah, and then we'll come back, and hopefully that goes well. If you have any questions, send them in the chat. Happy to answer or jump into a group and help out. Hey, Samaya, are you all good?
Whoops. Thank you.
Sorry, Terence.
It's okay.
Did I interrupt you?
Yes.
My bad.
Sort of.
I'll leave the Zoom open for you so you can pick the conversation up if you want.
No, just kidding. It's okay.
No.
Oh,
Sorry. What did you say, Pierre?
we didn't switch. I did not realize time was going by that quickly.
Yeah, I think we did the same thing. I was just chatting along, and Dawn was probably waiting for a chance, and she didn't get one.
She didn't get one. That's all right. You were really in the zone in terms of being an interviewee and just losing track of time. How was that? Any reflections on that as sort of like a taster of what it's like?
I think it went well. I think it would have been easier if I knew what the topic was going to be beforehand and could like prepare questions. But I think I did okay with coming up with questions on the spot. And Andrew was pretty good about elaborating on his answers. So like there were things I could pick from and just like ask about.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Yeah, it is easier when you have time to prepare, but we like to put you on the spot. Anyone else?
Well,
Go on. How was? Oh, Terrence, go.
our interviews were great. I think my partner would say the same thing. They were absolutely great. We got a chance to learn a whole lot about each other. And also what made it really great was, in my opinion at least, the respect level. I think the respect between us made us listen a whole lot more and better and, more empathetic. And therefore we learned a lot. And I think it encouraged us, at least me, it encouraged me to even want to ask more deep questions. But it was a fun listening time.
Yep,
That's
I
good.
agree.
That's good. That's what we wanna. That's what we want. Awesome. Anyone else want to share their thoughts? Should I pick on people? Nicholas, what did you think? Or Kuldeep? Or Vicky?
It went well. Yeah, it was a bit tough to come up with a question as soon as the room started, but I think it really it went really well, and Kyle really answered really well, and yeah, I think it was good as far as. But yeah, I feel like when it reached after 7 minutes, it was going to get more interesting, but yeah, like because of the time constraint, you couldn't get more deeper into the yeah. So that's about it.
Yep, cool, awesome, sounds good. That's good to hear. All right, Terrence, I got your message. I'll send it to you after the conversation. All right, so we'll talk about recording and sort of taking notes. On the right there is like an example booklet of what it looks like, and you've got like sort of quotes, which is people's just word for word, like this is what they said. Observations, say in terms of like the environment, or if you notice that they were a bit uncomfortable around a question, or smiled at a specific question, or things like that. And then sort of reflections, both your reflections on the interview in terms of what you learned, but also reflections on like how you as a team or as a pair facilitated the interview. So often what we want when we're taking notes is we want to use participants' own words, especially if you're sharing those stories back, which you often are, because you're doing research on behalf of someone or an organization or whatever. You want to use people's own words, with the swear words, with all the colorful language that they use, to really show the emotion that they were, talking about the topic with, and to sort of, just describe their needs exactly how they said it. So again, trying to remove that interpretation layer. You want to note important body language. So like I said, tone of voice or the environment or, whether they moved or they're standing up at a specific point. You want to listen for golden quotes, and golden quotes, it's probably, I don't know if it's common terminology, but for me, golden quotes are like things that you're like, yeah, this is definitely going to make the report, or, you know, this is definitely going to make the session where we play back what we heard. And you'll know when you hear it, you know. And then the other thing is you want to distinguish observation from interpretation. Again, you want to sort of like, this is what we observed. I think this because blah, right? So you want to make that really sort of explicit, because when it comes, you know, often you'll be running like 10 or 15 interviews, and then, you know, it'll all become sort of a blurb sometimes. And then you really sort of want to remember like what actually happened versus how you interpret it. And just one note is to remember privacy, especially if you're sharing those notes, you know, using P1 as opposed to names, or, you know, removing identifiers like gender and, you know, what organization they work for or what street they live in on and things like that. Any questions about that? All right, I'll take that as a no. So tips, you're doing a good job. You're probably doing a good job if people are sharing their stories. If you're doing far more listening than talking, often the ratio is like, you know, 80-20 of you, like of the other person talking versus you talking, or, you know, 90-10. You don't want to sort of, I know sometimes we like to hear the sound of our own voices, but you don't want to hear your voice a lot during that time. And you're following their stories and going deeper on that. And that's leading to like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that. Or, you know, those types of insights where you're like, wow, I just learned something new that I didn't know before. And you're probably not doing a good job if you're getting yes or no answers. You probably actually want to sort of take a step back. If you're getting yes or no answers, you want to take a step back and sort of get people a bit more comfortable. Use those broad questions to sort of understand their experience, and then before you get deeper. And you definitely don't want to be sharing your experience or advice if you feel like, you know, oh, like I know how the person can apply for this grant or this government, whatever. You could do that after the interview, but definitely not during the interview. Was anyone going to say something there?
So I don't know if I'm being redundant here, if you've already mentioned this, but I was thinking about the importance of doing research. Like, you do the research and then the questions come out of the actual experience, as opposed to our prepared or scripted questions. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think so often what we'll do is we'll have like 3 to 5 sort of big questions, but really the specific questions that you're asking during the conversation are relating to what the person said, right? So you've got like, you know, we want to understand what it's like when someone found out that, you know, they will need to take care of their parent, right? But it's not like you don't have very specific questions around that. The specific questions really come from hearing the person's story around like, you know, how did you manage, for example, money and things like that. So yeah, you've got like broad questions before your interviews, because you do want to understand, or you want to outline what it is that you want to understand about their experience, but not very specific questions. The specific questions really come from the interview itself.
Okay.
Good questions, Terence. All right. So after listening to the interview, what you want to do is you want to sort of take the time with your team or your pair to really sort of answer some of these questions. And, you know, you'll change these questions depending on the interview, but some of them could be like, what was happening for this person? What did we feel like they needed, or what did they say they need? What did they talk positively and negatively about? Like, you know, they might say, for example, when I was, you know, doing this specific thing that felt really good, but, you know, when I was dealing with this specific organization that didn't feel so good. And then you know, you want to sort of discuss why you thought that was. And then the 2 last questions are really interesting, I think, often to sort of reflect on. It's like, what was surprising to us? You know, what do we know now that we didn't know before? And then what was contradictory? Because often people will contradict themselves. Like, you know, they'll say like, you know, my health is really important to me. And then you'll ask them, how many times do you eat fast food a month? And they'll say, you know, 15 times. So you also want to note those, you know, inconsistencies down, because they'll be helpful to explore. That's all. Any questions before we round the session off?
So did you mention before about the time to document and notate? You know, I'm thinking that you don't want to do that during the interview, or you want to do it as less as possible.
Yeah.
Because you don't want it to interfere with the interview or listening or be offensive to the interviewee. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say I think definitely don't use devices. Often people sort of see devices as almost like a barrier, especially if you're like typing on a laptop or something. So often, if often people will take notes, to be honest, but they'll do it like handwritten, and they might, do shortcuts. And obviously, the more interviews you do, the more you learn how to take notes and stuff. But they'll do shortcuts for a quote, say, and then post interview they'll really sort of nut that out. But you don't want to completely rely on your memory. You do want to take some notes during the interview, and usually people are pretty comfortable. Obviously, again, it depends on the setting, and if you notice that the person is looking at you really strange every time you put pen to paper, then maybe just put it aside and just listen, and then you can take notes later. But that's also why we say do it in pairs, because often one person is leading the interview, the other person's sort of taking notes, so that the person leading the interview is just taking notes on like questions that they want to follow up on or points that they want to follow up on, and the person taking notes is really there just to take notes and listen carefully. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. So next week, hopefully some of the teams will have done at least a few interviews. So next week we're going to be talking about synthesis, making sense of what we've listened to, what we found out about, and sharing that and playing that back. And for this week for teams, they're gonna, if you're part of a team, you're gonna do some reflexivity exercises before your interviews. You're gonna facilitate conversations with 5 people around your topic, and then you'll actually reflect on your conversation, both in terms of how you went as a team, how you facilitated the conversation, but also what did you learn from that. That's all. So yeah, thanks so much for making the time. What I'll do is I'll post a link to the next, in case you want to come, it will just be easy. That's the link for the next event. And yeah, if people want to stay back and discuss anything, Terence and Kyle, I think you had a couple of questions that you wanted to discuss. We'll talk about that. But yeah, does anyone have any thoughts or reflections on how that went? No thoughts, no reflections. Should I pick on people? I'll pick on people. Pia, what did you think of that?
I thought that was great.
I paid Pia to say. Dawn, Dawn, I think dropped off. Anyone? Oh, Dawn didn't drop off. Dawn, any thoughts on that? Or Nicholas? Or anyone?
No, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening to him share about his job and what he's working on. It was really interesting. It was nice getting to know somebody else in the group.
That's good. Awesome. Sounds